Picture two elders. Both are 75 years old. The first one wakes up slowly, gripping the edge of the bed before standing. His knees ache before his feet even touch the floor. Stairs feel like a negotiation. Long walks feel like a risk. By afternoon, the fatigue settles in so deeply that the couch becomes the only place that makes sense. Now picture the second elder. He rises before the sun, walks several miles across open land without assistance, kneels to tend the fire, carries weight on his back, works with his hands through the morning cold, and at night sleeps deeply without struggle. This second elder had no orthopedic clinic, no joint supplements lining his kitchen counter, no surgery scheduled for the spring. He was Lakota, a man of the Great Plains of North America, and nearly every morning of his adult life, he consumed something that his grandmother had taught his mother, and his mother had taught him, something that the Lakota people believed was one of the most important foundations of a body that aged with strength rather than surrender. A broth, ancient, slow, almost entirely forgotten. And the question that lingers is this: what did they understand about the human body that we have quietly left behind? For a long time, modern medicine has told us that joint pain is simply part of getting older, inevitable, expected, something to manage with medication, not something to prevent with food. But the Lakota people saw aging in a completely different way. They did not believe the body broke down with time by accident. They believed the body weakened when it stopped receiving what it needed, when the wrong foods replaced the right ones, when hurried preparation replaced slow, intentional cooking, when the noise of daily life replaced the quiet rhythms the body depended on. The elders of the Lakota did not see aching knees as a sentence. They saw them as a signal, a message from the body that something essential was missing. And what was missing, more often than not, was something as humble and ancient as a broth simmered low and slow over an open fire, sometimes for an entire day, sometimes for two. Further along, you'll understand exactly why the Lakota considered the time spent cooking to be just as important as the ingredients themselves. And the reason surprised even the youngest members of the tribe. To understand the value of this broth, you first need to feel the world it came from. The Great Plains of North America are one of the most demanding landscapes on the continent. Summers that press down with relentless heat, winters that freeze the ground solid for months, wind that never fully stops, a horizon so wide and open it can feel both humbling and magnificent at the same time. The Lakota people who lived across what is now South Dakota, Nebraska, and Wyoming had no pharmacies, no hospitals, no laboratories to analyze what was inside their food. They had the land, they had generations of observation, and they had a relationship with the animals and plants around them that was built not on convenience, but on deep, accumulated understanding. And yet, early ethnographers and explorers from the 19th century wrote repeatedly about something they found striking when encountering Lakota elders. Men and women well past the age of 70 who moved with surprising ease, who squatted low to tend the fire without wincing, who walked long distances without complaint, who carried themselves with a kind of physical, quiet confidence that seemed to defy what European observers expected from people their age. There were many reasons for this, but one of the most consistent, woven through the daily life of nearly every Lakota family across the seasons, was the regular consumption of bone broth made from the buffalo. For the Lakota, the buffalo was not simply an animal. It was the center of everything. Every part of the animal was used. The hide became shelter and clothing. The sinew became cord and thread. The dried dung became fuel for the fire, and the bones, especially the large, dense, marrow-rich bones of the legs and spine, became the foundation of one of the most nourishing preparations in the entire Lakota tradition. The elders believed that the bones held the deepest strength of the buffalo, not the strength of the muscles, which was visible and obvious, but a quieter, more enduring strength, the kind that sustained the buffalo across hundreds of miles of frozen plains during the long winter migrations. That strength, they believed, could be drawn out, but only slowly, only with patience, only with low fire, clean water, and time. This was the buffalo bone broth, and there was one detail in its preparation that almost no one today recognizes. a detail that the Lakota women who made this broth considered the difference between a broth that nourished and a broth that merely filled. The broth was never made in a hurry. In the Lakota tradition, the process often began the evening before, or at the very first light of morning. The large bones, femur, tibia, vertebrae, were cracked open with smooth river stones to expose the marrow inside. They were then placed into vessels made of clay or into the buffalo's own stomach lining, which had been cleaned and made watertight, covered with cold water and heated stones pulled from the edge of the fire. The stones were replaced continuously, hour after hour, to maintain a steady, gentle heat. This process lasted for most of a day, sometimes longer. There was no rushing. There was only intention. The older women of the Lakota community were most often the keepers of this preparation. They understood through knowledge passed down across generations that patience was an invisible ingredient, one that could not be substituted or skipped. If you rush the fire, you will lose what is inside, was a teaching that appeared in different words throughout Lakota oral tradition. And as the broth cooked, something was happening inside those bones. The marrow softened and dissolved slowly into the water, the minerals released gradually. The rich fat from inside the bone rose to the surface in a slow, quiet bloom, and the liquid deepened in color, from pale and thin to dark, dense and fragrant with the smell of the plains in winter. A smell that those who grew up in Lakota households carried with them for the rest of their lives as one of the most comforting memories they owned. And the marrow itself, what the Lakota drew out of those bones, was considered the most precious part of the entire preparation. You'll understand why in just a moment. There was one element inside the broth that Lakota elders valued above all others, the marrow. The bone marrow that filled the interior of the buffalo's large bones was treated as something close to sacred. It was not food for every day and every person. It was reserved for the elders, for those recovering from long hunts or heavy labor, for anyone the community recognized as needing deep, sustained nourishment. When the broth had finished cooking and was left to cool slightly, the dissolved marrow formed a thick, rich layer across the surface. That layer was never skimmed away and discarded. It was carefully preserved, sometimes stirred back into the broth, sometimes eaten separately with quiet deliberateness. The Lakota elders said that this fat was what kept the joints moving freely, that it was the marrow that allowed the knee to bend without pain, the hip to turn without grinding, the shoulder to rise without resistance. There was no scientific language for this understanding. There was observation. There was the lived experience of generations who had watched what happened to people who consumed this broth regularly, compared to those who did not. And there was the simple, visible fact that the elders who honored this preparation tended to age differently than those who abandoned it. The bone broth was rarely prepared without additions gathered from the land around the Lakota camps. Depending on the season and what was available, the women who tended the fire would add roots and wild plants that grew across the plains. Wild onion and wild garlic, which the Lakota had harvested from riverbanks for centuries, were common additions, added not only for the depth of flavor they gave, but because the elders believed they helped the body receive what the broth offered more completely. Sumac berries, dried and slightly crushed, were stirred into the broth in certain seasons. Their sharp, faintly tart quality was prized. The Lakota believed sumac had a relationship with warmth inside the body, that it encouraged something in the blood and circulation that the cold months suppressed. In late summer, when the prairie was generous, dried choke cherries were occasionally added to broths meant for older members of the community. Small, deeply colored, intensely flavored, they were considered one of the plains' most important foods for elders specifically. Notice what is not on this list. Nothing complicated. Nothing requiring preparation that took more than what the land and the season provided. Just simple, specific combinations refined over centuries of experience. Think about your own kitchen for a moment. How often do you cook with what the season outside your window is offering? The buffalo bone broth was not reserved for special occasions or ceremonies. It was part of daily life, especially in winter. On the coldest mornings, when the air pressed stiff against every joint and the body woke rigid and reluctant, the broth was the first thing consumed. Hot. Served in wooden bowls worn smooth from years of use. Drunk slowly, in the quiet of early morning, while the plains outside were still dark and the fire inside was still finding its strength. The Lakota elders did not drink their morning broth standing up, moving from one task to the next. They sat. They wrapped both hands around the bowl. They breathed the steam before the first sip. They allowed the warmth to enter the body gradually, through the hands, through the nose, before ever reaching the stomach. This was not incidental. It was intentional. The broth was also consumed in the evenings after the most physically demanding days. After long hunts that tested the legs and back, after moving camp across miles of open terrain, after any effort the body recognized as having asked something significant of itself. On those evenings, the broth was drunk warm with a few additional herbs in a quiet space, away from the noise of the larger fire and the activity of the camp. The body had worked hard. Now the body would be honored. Consider this for a moment. After your most physically demanding days, the ones that leave your knees stiff and your back heavy, what do you give your body before sleep? Something fast and convenient, or something slow, warm, and intentional? There was something deeper in this practice than nutrition. For the Lakota, the body and the land followed the same rhythms. Winter was not a season to fight. It was a season to respect. The body, like the earth, required deeper, slower, denser nourishment during the cold months. It was not a time for lightness. It was a time to feed the innermost layers. The bones, in Lakota understanding, represented the most fundamental structure of life, the part that remained when everything else dissolved. To nourish the bones with a broth made from bones was, in a way, to nourish the very foundation of one's own existence. This might sound poetic, but it produced practical habits, habits that were maintained with quiet discipline, season after season, across generations. And those habits were visible in how the elders moved, in how they aged, in the ease with which they carried themselves through the winters of their lives. Something shifted when life on the plains was disrupted, when the Lakota were forced onto reservations, when the buffalo herds that had sustained entire civilizations for thousands of years were nearly destroyed in less than a decade, when traditional food systems were replaced, abruptly, violently, with government-issued flour, sugar, and canned goods. The broth began to disappear, not all at once. These things rarely disappear all at once. They fade at the edges first. The youngest generation stops learning. The middle generation stops practicing. And then one day only the oldest remember, and they find fewer and fewer who want to listen. The grandmothers who still knew how to crack a bone and read the fire, and know by the smell alone when the broth was ready. They carried that knowledge quietly, waiting. This is not a story about blame. It is a story about loss. Because the understanding of how to nourish the body deeply, how to honor the rhythms of aging, how to prepare food that sustained the physical structure not just for a day but across decades, that understanding was rare and hard-won and irreplaceable. And like most irreplaceable things, its absence was not felt immediately. It was felt slowly, across generations. Today, in Lakota communities across South Dakota and beyond, something quiet is happening. There is no fanfare around it, no social media campaign, no wellness brand attached to it. There are simply families, some of them, returning to the fire, returning to the slow broth, returning to the knowledge that grandmothers kept alive through the most difficult of circumstances. They are doing it with what the land now offers: grass-fed cattle bones from local farms, wild plants gathered the way they were always gathered, carefully, with gratitude, in the right season. The same patience, the same low flame, the same willingness to wait for what cannot be rushed. What they are finding is not a trend. It is a memory, and a memory, when it returns after long absence, has a particular quality. It feels both new and ancient at the same time. It feels, in the most honest sense of the word, like coming home. There is a kind of knowledge that does not live in books or laboratories. It lives in the hands, in the way a woman cracks a bone against stone and knows by the sound whether the marrow inside is ready, in the particular patience required to tend a fire for hours without losing attention or interest, in the decision, made quietly, without announcement, to give the body something slow instead of something fast. The Lakota elders did not have access to the modern tools we use to analyze food. They could not measure what was inside the broth in milligrams or percentages, But they had something that may be harder to find today than any supplement on any shelf: attention, presence. The habit of treating the body not as a problem to solve or a machine to maintain, but as something worthy of care. Deep, patient, consistent care. Aging with strength and dignity was never, for the Lakota, a matter of luck. It was a matter of practice, of rhythm, of honoring what the land offered and what the body needed season after season, year after year, decade after decade. And perhaps what so many of us are searching for, in clinics, in pharmacies, in the long corridors of medical offices, has always existed in a simpler, quieter form, in a bowl held with both hands, in steam rising slowly in the cold morning air, in the patience to let something cook long enough to give everything it has. The knowledge has not entirely disappeared. It is still there in the hands of those who remembered, waiting, as it always has, for those willing to sit down, slow down, and listen. End of script.